The fact that Vanity Fair had the gall to say that this was a list of the kids who are going to own Hollywood is absolutely crazy in hindsight, because this is a full-grown man. Hi there, my name is Tessa, and in my recent video covering Vanity Fair's 2003 It's Totally Raining Teens issue, I asked if you guys would be interested in hearing me talk about their follow-up 5 years later, to which I received a resounding yes. A list of the 27 kids who will totally own the next 10 years, the 2008 issue is pretty lackluster compared to 2003 if you ask me. Perhaps because it came out at the tail end of the 2000s youthquake. Besides being a pretty mediocre editorial from a visual standpoint, they barely talk to the celebrities in question, instead focusing on the outcome of their previous issue, the dangers of social media, and Barack Obama. In spite of that, it's still a pretty interesting list, mostly because of how hit or miss it is. I'm going to start off where the magazine does with Amanda Seyfried, who was 22. Amanda's first big role was as Karen in Mean Girls in 2004, although she actually auditioned for the part of Katie, which wound up going to Lindsay Lohan. Although the movie was a smash hit, Amanda's career didn't exactly blow up. And after failing to land the lead role in Veronica Mars, she just made a bunch of guest appearances on different TV shows. Thankfully, in 2006, she was cast in Big Love, which received critical acclaim and became her real breakthrough role. She mentions her upcoming project, Mamma Mia, which as we all know was a huge success, and it fully catapulted her to A-list status. From that point onwards, she was in several movies back to back to back, including Jennifer's Body, Dear John, Chloe, Letters to Juliet, Red Riding Hood, In Time, and Les Miserables. And while these movies had differing critical and commercial success, they fully showed off her range in the comedy, romance, drama, and action departments. She's been booked pretty consistently for the last decade, but none of her projects have made much of an impact, apart from her role on The Dropout as Elizabeth Holmes, which won her her first Golden Globe. And it's actually a recurring joke between me and my friends to kind of do her little creep dance. I think it's really cute that she mentions that Miu Miu is one of her favorite brands, even though she can't afford it, because she actually became one of their ambassadors in 2016, which is a nice full circle moment. Next is Emma Roberts, who was 17. I'm actually surprised that they included Emma on this list. Don't get me wrong, she's probably the person in this roundup whose work I was most familiar with at the time, but it just feels kind of out of character for Vanity Fair in this specific issue. She lists her breakout role as Addie on the Nickelodeon TV show Unfabulous, as well as her lead role in Nancy Drew, which I personally consider aquamarine erasure. She also talks about her upcoming movie, Wild Child, and the sort of snotty, selfish character type was actually something pretty new for her, which is pretty ironic since those types of characters have basically become her specialty. Her last family-friendly role was in Hotel for Dogs in 2009, before switching to a very specific brand of manic pixie dream girl in comedy dramas like Lime Life, The Art of Getting By, and It's Kind of a Funny Story. In 2013, she joined the cast of American Horror Story Coven, and if you were an angsty teen girl during that era, then you know how much of an impact that show had.
Wear something black.
She was by no means my favorite out of all of the witches, but she nailed that character. This was the beginning of her collaborations with Ryan Murphy, and she subsequently starred in several more seasons of American Horror Story and also led the short-lived series Scream Queens. Her more recent roles have been all over the place, flipping between indie horrors and generic rom-coms, none of which have performed particularly well. Emma dated her American Horror Story co-star Evan Peters for several years, breaking up and getting back together multiple times. And in 2013, there was even an incident where Emma was detained for a domestic dispute, although the couple would later release a joint statement saying it was a misunderstanding. More recently, she was linked to Garrett Hedlund, another actor who was all the rage in the 2010s, but I hadn't even heard that they were together until looking into it for this video. In the 2003 issue, they were pretty open about any of the celebrities' industry affiliations, so I find it interesting that they chose not to mention Emma's father or aunt, who are pretty big names in Hollywood. I guess she didn't want to talk about nepotism? Next is Blake Lively, who was 20. The popularity of Gossip Girl was probably what led to the magazine pushing for this issue's concept, so I'm not surprised that Blake was featured prominently throughout it. She not only appeared on the cover, but also on this spread, and another one with the rest of her Gossip Girl co-stars. As someone who was the exact target demographic for Gossip Girl when it came out, There's no denying that the series catapulted Blake to it girl status. And both on and off screen, she cultivated this image of a sort of glamorous and sexy fashionista. Because of the nature of the series, Blake's acting wasn't all that impressive. But if you watched her in The Private Lives of Pippa Lee or Hick, it's pretty obvious that she can hold her own when she needs to. I also really enjoyed her in the first Simple Favor movie. The sequel, not so much. In 2010, while filming that really terrible Green Lantern movie, she met Ryan Reynolds, who promptly divorced then-wife Scarlett Johansson and began dating Blake instead. The couple married in 2012, controversially, at a former plantation in South Carolina, which they've since apologized for. Most recently, Blake's been embroiled in a legal dispute with her former It Ends With Us co-star and director, Justin Baldoni, alleging that he had sexually harassed her on set and had orchestrated a smear campaign to turn the public against her. Blake was never that well-liked, even at the height of her career. It was more like she embodied a very specific type that women found aspirational. But in the wake of all of the It Ends With Us drama, the public's attitude towards her has kind of shifted from envy to outright disdain. Next is Kristen Stewart, who is 18. Once again, I find it interesting which roles they wind up picking as their breakthrough, because she winds up listing The Panic Room and Into the Wild. Now, don't get me wrong, she's absolutely amazing in The Panic Room, and it's generally the reason why I spent a solid decade defending her from the she can't act accusations. But what about Zathura, Speak, or Catch That Kid? Hello? I'm surprised that she didn't mention Twilight in her upcoming roles section, considering it did come out in 2008, but maybe that's because Vanity Fair was planning to dedicate a spread to the entire cast later that year. Twilight was an entire cultural movement, revitalizing the public's interest in vampires and solidifying the YA genre as a moneymaker. And by 2012, Kristen had become one of the highest paid actresses in Hollywood. She continued the blockbuster route with Snow White and the Huntsman, which, while commercially successful, earned her a good amount of criticism, not only for her acting, but because she was caught kissing her director, Rupert Sanders. Even though he was a good 20 years older than her, and the one with a wife and kids, Kristen was the one who caught the most flack, with Donald Trump even having a bizarre obsession with the scandal.
I don't think Donald Trump hated me. I think he's in love with my boyfriend. And Donald, if you didn't like me then, you're really probably not gonna like me now, because I'm hosting SNL and I'm like so gay, dude.
Kristen had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with her Twilight co-star Robert Pattinson for years, but this seemed to be the final nail in the coffin, with the two officially breaking up in 2013. Afterwards, Kristen was linked to several women, including St. Vincent, Stella Maxwell, and most recently, Dylan Meyer, who she married earlier this year. I never understood why people were surprised when she came out, because I had already clocked that back in 2010 when she was in The Runaways. Apart from the incredibly misguided Charlie's Angels reboot, for the last decade or so, her projects have been rather low-key. But she did receive critical acclaim in 2021 for Spencer, which earned her an Oscar nomination. While she intends to continue acting, recently she's expressed an interest in writing, producing, and directing, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Next is Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who is 19. Yes, you heard that right. McLovin is in this. Now, Superbad was a massively successful and influential teen movie in the 2000s, but it didn't really make Chris a star. In fact, it just wound up typecasting him, and his subsequent roles in Kick-Ass and Role Models were just slight variations of the same cringy comic relief character. He never really grew as an actor, playing the same socially awkward types in all of his other projects, and his most consistent gig has been as Fish Legs in the How to Train Your Dragon franchise. Next is Zoe Kravitz, who was 19. At the time this issue was published, Zoe had barely any film credits to her name, and I'm genuinely confused by her inclusion. They make no reference to her parents, Lisa Bonet and Lenny Kravitz, whose connections definitely opened a few doors early in her career. Now, I'm not saying that she isn't talented, and she definitely has seen a lot of success since, but at the time, there wasn't really anything that pointed to that. And in all honesty, Vanity Fair just got lucky. She'd had small roles in No Reservations and The Brave One, and despite watching both movies multiple times, I always forget that she's even in them. Her upcoming project was Assassination of a High School President, where she was effectively an extra, and for the next few years she flipped between music and random indie roles. The role that brought her to prominence was Angel in X-Men First Class in 2011, and she continued in this YA blockbuster direction with a small part in the Divergent series. Her next notable role was as one of Immortan Joe's wives in Mad Max Fury Road, which was probably her most critically acclaimed film to date. In 2017, she appeared in Big Little Lies, and despite being up against some acting veterans, she was able to hold her own. Her most recent role of note was as Catwoman in the latest iteration of The Batman, where she definitely nailed the character's sensuality and mystery. And even though I doubt that she'll make a return to the series, I'd be very open to it. Next is Emma Stone, who was also 19. Her filmography was also pretty limited when this issue launched, only appearing in a handful of TV shows in addition to Superbad. But her career quickly picked up steam, appearing in The House Bunny, Easy A, Ghosts of Girlfriends Past, The Rocker, Crazy Stupid Love, and Zombieland, where she specialized in slightly goofy characters riddled with sarcasm who were more approachable than other love interests of the time period. In 2011, she starred in The Help, her first period drama, and while there were some similarities to prior characters she had played, it showed how she could handle dramatic roles just as well as comedic ones, and became her most critically and commercially successful film. She edged into A-list status after taking on the role of Gwen Stacy in The Amazing Spider-Man, and later received her first Academy Award nomination in 2014 for Birdman. By 2016, she had fully moved into prestige films, with the likes of La La Land, Battle of the Sexes, and The Favorite, which earned her widespread praise. While she had a few mainstream performances in The Croods 2, Cruella, and Zombieland 2, for the last few years, she's stayed firmly in the black comedy space, becoming known for her collaborations with director Yorgos Lanthimos. A natural blonde, Emma first dyed her hair red for Superbad back in 2007, and it's since become her signature color. It's still what I'm most used to, but I can appreciate the moments when she switches to blonde or brunette. Next is Olivia Thirlby, who is 21. Her breakout role was in Juno as Leah, who was outwardly the popular cheerleader type, but had her fair share of unusual quirks. She starred in similar indie comedy dramas throughout the 2000s, including New York I Love You, Love Comes Lately, What Goes Up, and The Whackness, where she was continually cast as a sexually mature teenager. Although her performances were praised, her parts in these projects were pretty small, and with none of them being smash hits, her prestige slowly declined. Her most high-profile role was in 2012 in Dread, which was based on the comic series of the same name, but the film was a box office bomb, killing any hopes of a sequel. For the last few years, she's been relegated to random indie projects that haven't made much noise. But in 2025, she did land a recurring role on Law & Order: Organized Crime. I feel like she really had a lot of potential back in the day, and I'm genuinely surprised that her career never took off, because she could have definitely been a sort of Aubrey Plaza, Kat Dennings type. Next is Jessica Szohr, who is 23. Jessica had guest appearances on several sitcoms before being cast as Vanessa in Gossip Girl. Originally a recurring role, she was promoted to the main cast halfway through the first season, a choice that fans, as well as the writer of the books, Cecily von Ziegesar, weren't all that pleased about. A lot of the hate directed towards her at the time was super messed up, because people basically refused to separate her from her character. And I also think the fact that she was the only non-white actress on the show made her a very easy target. Compared to the rest of the cast, Jessica didn't receive any high-profile brand deals or major movie contracts, as evidenced by her appearance in Piranha 3D, which became known for its absolutely absurd premise and excessive nudity. Although she's been in several films over the last decade, she's never been the lead, and I think she's officially slid into C-list territory. Next is Penn Badgley, who is 21. Penn was cast in a couple of TV shows prior to Gossip Girl, including Do-Over, The Mountain, and The Bedford Diaries, all of which were canceled after a single season. Ouch. I remember first seeing him in John Tucker Must Die, where the hair department did him absolutely dirty, and I almost didn't even recognize him as Dan Humphrey. He was a main cast member for the series' entire run from 2007 to 2012, but during that time he was also in a handful of movies including Easy A and Margin Call. The CW isn't really considered prestige television, and throughout the 2010s, Penn struggled to find consistent work. But he had a career resurgence in 2018 when he began starring as Joe Goldberg in You. While still a bit cheesy and formulaic, it was a very different character from Dan Humphrey, and his performance continued to be praised even after the series' decline in quality. With You only just reaching its conclusion, it'll be interesting to see what he gets up to next. Will he just move on to another TV show, or will he try his hand at being a leading man? Next is Chace Crawford, who is 23. I distinctly remember watching Gossip Girl and thinking that Chace was the most beautiful man that I'd ever seen in my entire life, which I still think is the case to this day. And I always thought it was funny that they didn't even really bother to do anything with his character. He just had to stand around and be hot. Now, I did know that he could act because I'd seen him in 12, but I'll be honest, I actually think his face might have hurt his chances, because he could never believably play the chill bartender or the small town boy, which might have been why he was recast in the Footloose remake. Although I'd love to visit the alternate universe where it did happen, because I think seeing him doing all of those line dances would have changed the trajectory of my teenage life. His next notable role was in 2019 when he was cast as the Deep in The Boys, a character who is absolutely despicable, but that he plays brilliantly, being the perfect combination of stupid, manipulative, and goofy. And I genuinely think that if it weren't for the fact that he had the face that poets write sonnets about, he could have been one of the greatest comedy actors of an entire generation. Next is Ed Westwick, who is 21. Although Ed had a few small parts in British productions, Gossip Girl was his very first American project, and it quickly catapulted him to fame. Out of all of the guys on the show, Chuck was definitely my least favorite. He was just so skeevy and slimy, and honestly, in those early seasons, he dressed so ridiculously that I just couldn't take him seriously, especially as a romantic interest. So before you ask, yes, I was a Dan and Blair shipper. In the article, he talks about his upcoming project, 100 Feet, a horror that premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel, which, as you can probably expect, got very little buzz. This didn't tank his career, however, and in 2010 he had a small role in Clint Eastwood's J. Edgar, and also led the poorly received rom-com Chalet Girl. When Gossip Girl concluded in 2012, he appeared in a few other movies, including Romeo and Juliet, Bone in the Throat, Billionaire Ransom, and The Crash, all of which were box office disappointments. And since then, his projects have only gotten crappier and crappier. In 2017, he was accused of sexual misconduct by 3 separate women, but the charges were dropped the following year for lack of evidence, although Ed's scenes in the BBC series Ordeal by Innocence were reshot with a different actor. While Gossip Girl was airing, Ed was the lead singer of a punk band, The Filthy Youth, which actually had a couple of songs make their way onto the series soundtrack. I actually preferred him as a singer than an actor, but the group never really took off, and Ed proceeded to join a different band, For You, which actually released their debut album earlier this year. Next is Leighton Meester, who was 22. When Leighton was born, her parents were in federal prison, and she was raised by her grandparents until they were released. The family moved to New York City, where Leighton began modeling, and after that proved successful, she relocated to Los Angeles to explore an acting career. This led to parts in several iconic shows from the time period, including Entourage, House, Veronica Mars, Numbers, and 24. She was also a series regular in Tarzan and Surface, both of which received negative reviews and were canceled after a single season, which didn't really bode well for an up-and-coming actress. She was also in the ABC crime drama Secrets of a Small Town alongside Kaylee Cuoco, Lucy Hale, Denise Richards, and future Gossip Girl co-star Matthew Settle, but the project was never picked up for a full series order. Leighton originally auditioned for the part of Serena van der Woodsen, but they felt that she was a better fit for Blair Waldorf, and with the characters' hair colors being an important part of their dynamic, she went brunette for the role. Critics instantly called out her performance as one of the highlights of the series, and she appeared in a few other movies, including Remember the Days, The Haunting of Sorority Row, and Killer Movie. In 2009, she signed a recording contract with Universal Republic, and Good Girls Gone Bad, Somebody to Love, and Your Love's a Drug were released shortly after. Her debut album was expected to come out later that year, but after several delays, it was scrapped. In 2010, she starred in Country Strong, which was basically A Star is Born, but gender swapped, and after production wrapped, Tim McGraw gifted her a guitar, and feeling inspired, she joined the band Check in the Dark and began writing songs with a more folksy sound, which showed off her vocals a lot better than the synth pop direction she'd been pushed into earlier. 2011 was a really good year for her, starring in The Roommate, Monte Carlo, and The Oranges, where she was once again considered one of the highlights. It was during the filming of The Oranges that she met Adam Brody, who had also been a teen star because of his stint on The OC, and the two got married in 2014. That same year, she also released her debut album, Heartstrings, which I think is criminally underrated. 2025 is set to be her biggest year in a while, appearing in 3 separate shows, Good Cop, Bad Cop, Single Parents, and The Buccaneers. I'm particularly excited about the latter because I don't think I've ever seen her in a period drama. Next is Taylor Momsen, who was 15, the youngest person on this list, and by a pretty decent amount. I'm surprised that they didn't mention her breakout role as Cindy Lou Who in The Grinch That Stole Christmas, where she is absolutely the cutest thing you've ever seen. And you might have also seen her in Spy Kids 2 around the same time. She actually auditioned for the titular role of Hannah Montana on the Disney Channel, being one of the frontrunners alongside Daniela Monáe, Ali Michalka, and Miley Cyrus, but we all know who wound up getting the part. On the plus side, this left her free to pursue other roles, including Jenny Humphrey in Gossip Girl. In 2009, Taylor formed the rock band The Pretty Reckless, which signed a deal with Interscope Records, and in 2010 they released their debut album, Light Me Up, which angsty teen me was absolutely obsessed with. Taylor quickly began prioritizing her music career over her acting one, and wound up leaving Gossip Girl at the end of the 4th season. This wasn't all that surprising, considering Taylor had found acting rather alienating, even saying that the other kids at school bullied her. When I was younger, I never really thought that she was going to become a superstar. It just didn't seem like the kind of thing that she was interested in. But I remember being obsessed with her style. It was just the perfect combination of sexy, grungy punk. I have a bad time with crowds, so I'm not big on concerts, but the one and only show that I've ever been to in my life was for The Pretty Reckless. And I remember being so shocked by how good Taylor's voice and stage presence was, especially considering how young she was. The Pretty Reckless are still active to this day, but they haven't had a smash hit in a solid decade. Although considering Taylor is only 32, she has plenty of time to stage a comeback if she really wants to. Next is Jay Baruchel, who is 26. The fact that Vanity Fair had the gall to say that this was a list of the kids who are going to own Hollywood is absolutely crazy in hindsight, because this is a full-grown man. Jay's first major role was on Judd Apatow's short-lived series Undeclared, and in 2007 they reunited for Knocked Up, which is cited as Jay's breakout role. He followed this up with Tropic Thunder, Just Buried, and I'm Reed Fish, the latter pairing him up with Alexis Bledel. And I'm just surprised that they were already trying to push him down the rom-com route. I guess it was a good time to be a goofy guy in Hollywood. He did play against type in 2008 in Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist, where he was cast as Kat Dennings' douchey situationship. Maybe that's why they were paired up for this issue. 2010 was his big year, starring in She's Out of My League, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and voicing Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon, a role that he has returned to several times. Similar to Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who was also in the animated franchise, Jay was never able to break free from these sorts of dorky characters, and he hasn't really been a part of anything notable for the last decade. I do think that this editorial has peak "she looks absolutely beautiful and he's just there" energy, because Kat Dennings is just eating him up. And if this were an episode of America's Next Top Model, he would be going home. Next is Kat Dennings, who is 22. She started acting in commercials at the age of 9, and after graduating from homeschool at the age of 14, she and her family moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting full-time. Her debut was in an episode of Sex and the City, which is honestly so iconic of her. Her film debut was in 2004 in Raise Your Voice, which was followed up by supporting roles in The 40-Year-Old Virgin and Down in the Valley. I was first introduced to her in Charlie Bartlett, which I had just randomly rented from Blockbuster one day, and I remember thinking that she was super duper pretty, but in like an edgy way, which might have explained the character in her upcoming film, The House Bunny, who was transformed into a sexy but smart alt girl. And she played a similar, unusual, and sarcastic girl in Daydream Nation, which became my entire personality for like a solid month. She honestly played these sorts of characters a lot, as seen in To Write Love on Her Arms and Suburban Gothic. And I would basically describe her as the spookier, less mainstream version of Zooey Deschanel's Manic Pixie Dream Girl. In 2011, she began starring in Two Broke Girls, which is probably her most recognized role apart from Thor. And although I wasn't particularly fond of the sitcom, it wound up airing for 6 seasons, which is no small feat. It looks like she might be attempting to replicate the success of Two Broke Girls with another ABC series, Shifting Gears, which I've never heard of, but it was popular enough to get renewed for a 2nd season. I do like that when they asked her to choose between Tom Brady and Eli Manning, she picks Tom, but only because he's dating Gisele Bündchen, which is honestly so relatable. I also think it's interesting that despite being known as somewhat voluptuous, like it's joked about in a couple of her TV and movie roles, she didn't turn around and make her boobs her entire identity and brand. Maybe some other actresses could take notes. I don't know. Next are the Jonas Brothers, Kevin, who was 20, Joe, who was 18, and Nick, who was 15. As some of you may know, I was never big on the whole boy band thing, but the one and only exception were the Jonas Brothers, who I fell in love with the moment Disney started pushing them. At the time, I was a Nick girl because I was just a sucker for those curls, but I think now as an adult, I'm probably Team Kevin. Since this list is supposed to be about acting and not just fame in general, I'm not going to dive into their entire music career, including their solo projects, but just know that I am very tempted to buy tickets to their new reunion tour. When it came to name recognition, they were definitely some of the best known people on this list, but as musicians, not actors. So I do think that it's surprising that they were even included to begin with. Now, the article does mention Camp Rock, because how could they not, but also talks about the brothers' upcoming TV show, Jonas. So even though they did have a couple of these acting roles, once they left Disney in 2012, they basically never revisited it again, aside from Nick, that is, who had a stint of theater performances and movie roles throughout the 2010s and 2020s, the most memorable probably being Jumanji. Next is Rob Brown, who was 24. Rob's very first role was in 2000 in the film Finding Forrester, where he starred opposite Sean Connery, and some reviews even said that he outacted the James Bond legend. He continued playing sporty types throughout the 2000s in Take the Lead, The Express, and Coach Carter, because unfortunately at the time, those were basically the only types of roles that Hollywood would cast young Black actors in. In the 2010s, he pivoted to television, having roles on Treme from 2010 to 2013, Blind Spot from 2015 to 2020, and most recently in We Own This City in 2022. But he doesn't seem to have been in anything else since. Next is Michael Angarano, who was 20. Although his name doesn't ring a bell, I do recognize his face, and he was actually all over in the 2000s, like Little Secrets, Speak, and Will and Grace. I knew him from Sky High, which I unironically consider one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, but the article lists Lords of Dogtown as his breakout role. He's been in a bunch of movies in the years since, but usually as a supporting character. He's really, really good in the Stanford Prison Experiment though, and I feel like he would have been really, really successful in the horror space. From 2005 to 2009, he was dating Kristen Stewart. Then from 2013 to 2016, he was linked to Juno Temple, and he's currently married to Maya Erskine. The man deserves a round of applause for his excellent taste. Next is Summer Bishil, who is 20. If I was confused by some of the other picks on this list, this one has me outright baffled. Up until that point, she'd only made a few small appearances on the Disney Channel and Nickelodeon, and her only major role was in the indie film Towelhead, which hadn't even received a wide release at the time the issue was published. I'd compare it to Welcome to the Dollhouse, just with a more ethnically diverse cast, and even though it was received positively, it definitely didn't make Summer a star. She was in a few other projects in the years that followed, but the only one I'm remotely familiar with is Return to Halloween Town. And I suspect that Hollywood just wasn't sure what to do with an Indian Mexican woman at the time, which might explain why her most consistent role wasn't until 2015 in The Magicians, which reached its conclusion in 2020. Next is Hunter Parrish, who is 21. Again, I don't recognize the name, but I do know the face. One of his earliest roles was in the 2004 movie Sleepover, where he played one of the dorky boys who follows the girls around. Shortly after, he joined the main cast of Weeds, which introduced him to a wider audience, and he landed a handful of supporting roles. His upcoming project was 17 Again, and I can't believe how douchey they managed to make him look, because never in a million years would I have ever guessed that it was the same kid in Freedom Writers. Aside from a few other movies like It's Complicated and Still Alice, he's mostly been in the TV space, making a few appearances on Quantico, The Good Wife, Ratched, and This Is Us. Next is Josh Peck, who was 21. Josh was definitely one of the more well-known actors on this list at the time, and it sort of marked his transition out of child stardom.
Audition for this movie, Twilight. It's based on a book. It's going to be great. For who? Edward.
Wow.
I'm with my manager. He goes, it's down to you and 3 guys.
Really?
I hadn't even had a tummy tuck yet. I'm like, there's no way. He's got to be so shirtless. It's not going to happen.
Crap. As most of us know, he got his start on Nickelodeon, first appearing on The Amanda Show in 1999, before transitioning to Drake and Josh in 2004. During that time, he was also in a handful of kid-friendly movies like Snow Day and Max Keeble's Big Move. And for most of his early teens, Josh was typecast as the funny fat guy, which understandably, he wasn't too happy about. His upcoming project was The Whackness, which failed at the box office, and none of his projects in the years that followed performed much better. Honestly, for a solid chunk of the 2010s, he was better known for his spot in David Dobrik's Vlog Squad, although that eventually came to a very messy end. In 2022, Josh appeared in Oppenheimer, which also included Olivia Thirlby and Michael Angarano. And honestly, I wonder if Christopher Nolan had read this issue and was like, hold on, I have an idea. Because otherwise, I feel like it's just way too big of a coincidence. Next is Rachael Taylor, who was 24. One of the only non-Americans on this list, Rachael was born in Tasmania. And after competing in several beauty pageants, she began appearing in the Australian series Headland. She moved to California in her early 20s, and her big break was cited as Transformers. But I'm not gonna lie, I don't even remember her being in it, but that might be because Megan Fox was just occupying too much of my attention. Rachael was in a couple of horror movies, including See No Evil and Shudder, before transitioning into romantic roles with Bottle Shock and Splinterheads. In 2011, she was cast in the short-lived Charlie's Angels remake, and from that point onwards, she basically stuck to TV, appearing in 666 Park Avenue, Crisis, and Jessica Jones. If I'm being honest, I think the reason that Rachael never made it that far is because there honestly wasn't much that differentiated her from other blonde bombshells at the time, like Alice Eve or Brooklyn Decker. Next is Jonah Hill, who is 24. I would genuinely love to know how Jonah felt about this photo shoot, because these actresses kind of laying all over him like he's a prop kind of feels a little demeaning. Like many of his Superbad co-stars, Jonah was typecast as high-strung, immature characters for years, with very little differentiating his parts in Accepted, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and Get Him to the Greek. Ironically enough, he was also a member of the How to Train Your Dragon gang. And I do think it's interesting that the whole movie is just made up of funny guys from 2008. In 2011, he starred in Moneyball, even receiving an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and the film marked his successful transition into serious roles. From that point onwards, he swung back and forth. 21 Jump Street, then Wolf of Wall Street. This Is the End, then War Dogs. Maniac, then Don't Look Up. He's also worked off-camera, dipping his toes into writing, directing, and producing in projects like Mid-90s and Overcompensating. I think it'd be safe to say that he's probably one of the more respected actors on this list, at least within the industry. Last is Amber Heard, who was 22. The article cites her breakout role as Friday Night Lights in 2004, although her character is barely even in it, and most of her early roles were in similarly small parts. Her first lead role was in All the Boys Love Mandy Lane, where she was initially presented as the hot final girl, only to be the mastermind all along. And with a crucial part of the character being a sort of beauty that no one can resist, I think they absolutely nailed the casting. Because, wow, what a face. Hollywood seemed intent on making her a star, and she was in multiple projects every single year, although reception to them varied. And even when playing teens, like in The Stepfather or The Joneses, they couldn't help but draw attention to her looks. Side note, The Joneses is a really underrated movie that perfectly captures the vibe of the Great Recession. In 2011, Amber began starring in The Playboy Club, which was intended to ride the coattails of Mad Men, but the series was so poorly received that it was canceled after only 3 episodes aired. Although she was a fairly prominent actress, she was never trusted with leading a project, and was usually relegated to love interests. Amber had started dating fellow actor Johnny Depp in 2012, but in 2016, she filed for divorce and requested a restraining order. Although the two were eventually able to reach an agreement regarding these proceedings, in 2019, Johnny sued Amber for defamation, with Amber countersuing the following year. And after a widely publicized trial, both were found liable of defamation to some degree. Besides making Amber public enemy number 1, these proceedings also made her persona non grata in Hollywood. And apart from her recurring role as Mira in the DC universe, she effectively wasn't hired for anything else. Not that she seems to mind, having recently relocated to Spain where she lives with her 2 children. So like I said, this was a pretty weird list, especially considering the roster of young talent in 2008. For one, I don't understand how they didn't include Hayden Panettiere, who was in the midst of her stint on Heroes. And as any former tween girl can attest to, her roles in Ice Princess, Raising Helen, and Bring It On All or Nothing were simply iconic. Sure, she doesn't have a huge career now, but at the time, it would have been a pretty obvious choice, especially since she was only 19. This issue had a pretty high age average, which might have explained why Dakota Fanning, who was only 14, didn't make the cut. But considering 15-year-old Taylor Momsen was included, I feel like they could have made it work if they really wanted to. To this day, I still think that she's one of the most talented child actors that we've seen. Just watch Man on Fire, Uptown Girls, I Am Sam, War of the Worlds, or Hound Dog. She's amazing in all of them, even though they're situations that most elementary schoolers couldn't even imagine being in. I also think Freddie Highmore would have been a solid choice, but at 16, he might have been a smidge too young. Not to mention, too British for this extremely American list. But I think there are honestly more reasons to include him than not, especially considering his filmography at the time already included Finding Neverland, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, August Rush, and the Spiderwick Chronicles. Considering the Jonas Brothers made an appearance, I'm sure you're all wondering, why the hell is Miley Cyrus not there? But this was only a few short months after her bedsheet photo shoot, and even if Vanity Fair had invited her, I don't think she would have been very keen on returning. Now, I can understand why the rest of the Disney Channel gang didn't make the cut, but in 2008, Zac Efron would have been fresh out of starring in High School Musical 3 and Hairspray, which were massively successful and set him up as one of the biggest teen heartthrobs of the era. Some of the actors on this list had much smaller parts in much smaller movies. Make it make sense. Now, a few months after this issue was published, Teen Vogue released their own list of up-and-coming stars, which I of course own. And it had a way more interesting lineup if you ask me, like Kaya Scodelario, Selena Gomez, and Jennifer Lawrence. So let me know if you guys would be interested in a breakdown of that issue in the future as well. Anyway, that's it for this video, and I will see you next time.